I asked the old librarian for a book about the logistics of urban combat. He looked at me through the cloudy lenses of his glasses and quietly said that books would not help here. His dry hand settled on the edge of the wooden table. A dull click sounded from a hidden mechanism. The parquet floor under my feet simply vanished into nowhere. No magical glow, no portals with runes or voices of ancient gods. Only a sharp fall into darkness and the nauseating feeling of weightlessness. The smell of dusty paper instantly changed into the sickening stench of burned rubber, machine oil, and sea salt. The air became heavy and unnaturally hot. I crashed hard onto a solid steel surface. Cold water struck my face, flooding my eyes and mouth. Around me rose a deafening animal roar. My fingers convulsively dug into wet metal. I was being thrown from side to side. I was inside an iron box that was smashing through the waves. A landing boat. My historian mind gave me that fact before my eyes had time to adjust to the dull gray light. I was sitting among dozens of soldiers in helmets. They pressed against each other, heads sunk into their shoulders. Outside, a hailstorm hammered against the armored sides. But it was not rain. It was a lead machine gun downpour. I lowered my eyes to myself. My hands were shaking. I wore a heavy gray greatcoat of coarse wool. Silver officer shoulder boards shone on my shoulders. Lieutenant. I had become a lieutenant in an army I knew nothing about except what I had read in dusty archives, and we were sailing straight into an opened hell. To my right, a young man vomited yellow bile onto the ribbed floor of the boat. Nobody even noticed. Terror had paralyzed these people. No game interface before my eyes. No system notification about receiving skills. Only sticky fear that made my jaws clench. My mind clung to details, trying to save my sanity from breaking. A narrow bay, 3 tall brick chimneys on the horizon, the outlines of ruined docks. I knew this landscape from old black and white photographs. Port Verona, the site of one of the most senseless and bloody operations in history. High Command had thrown a landing force here only to distract the enemy from the main strike. No one planned to rescue us. We had been written off as expendable. The violent impact against the sandy bottom nearly broke my neck. The boat jerked and stopped. The front steel ramp began grinding down into the water. Our captain jumped up first. He drew a heavy revolver and shouted a regulation order for a frontal assault, waving his arms before the terrified men. A large caliber burst tore his chest apart before he managed a single step. Blood sprayed across the pale faces of the soldiers beside him. His dead body fell back heavily onto the slick metal. 42 men froze in total stupor. The commander had died in the first 3 seconds. The water was turning red. The machine gunner in the concrete bunker on shore methodically shifted his barrel toward our boat. His firing sector was perfect. The soldiers looked at me. I was the only officer still breathing. By regulation, I was supposed to raise them into the same hopeless bayonet charge against the bunker. If I stayed silent, we would simply be shot apart in the boat. If I ordered a retreat, our own side would put a bullet in my back for shameful desertion. My fingers found a ribbed metal whistle in the pocket of my greatcoat. My hands were shaking, but my mind stayed unnaturally cold and calculating. I was not an assault hero. I was a nerd who had spent years studying logistics maps and fortification diagrams. And I knew exactly where that bunker had a blind spot. I put the whistle between my teeth and blew with all my strength. The piercing sound cut through the thunder of battle for 1 second. The soldiers flinched, expecting an order to die. Cancel regulation. Throw smoke grenades. Pull back to the port warehouses. I shouted until my voice tore, pointing toward the brick dock buildings. The wind blew from the sea straight into the port. It was basic physics, which commanders ignored. Thick white smoke instantly covered our position. Sergeant Bruno, a huge man with the face of a butcher, grabbed me by the collar. He snarled, spraying spit, that I was a coward and disgraced the honor of the Imperial Navy. I struck his hand with the grip of my pistol. Either we run into the smoke, or you die here for a pretty line in a report. Choose faster, Sergeant. The platoon broke from the boat. We jumped into icy water, sinking knee-deep into sand, and ran through the white veil toward the massive red buildings of the docks. Bullets clicked blindly against the stones around us. Someone cried out and fell. I did not look back. In war, you cannot save those who have already stopped running forward. My lungs burned from the acrid smoke. We burst into the saving shadow between the docks, pressing against wet brick walls. The machine gun was behind us. I leaned against the wall, greedily swallowing air. We had escaped the direct line of fire. The concrete roof of the warehouse hung above us, giving an illusion of safety. Sergeant Bruno breathed heavily beside me. He spat blood and glared at me. 5 men had stayed on the beach. He blamed my cowardly order for it. 5 dead instead of 42. To me, that was excellent mathematics. To them, I had become a staff rat who feared an honest fight. Warehouse Zero, that was its name on old maps. Thick, fired brick walls, narrow windows under the ceiling. A perfect box for survival. I ordered the perimeter checked. The soldiers rose heavily, gripping rifles. Their uniforms were soaked through, their hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. The enemy already knew the landing force had not been destroyed. Outside, single shots cracked. Infantry patrols were converging on our shelter, encircling the building. 37 men, 15 working rifles, 2 crates of ammunition that had somehow not drowned, and a total lack of any tactical information. Barricade the gate with crate debris. I gave orders dryly, ignoring contemptuous looks. The main thing was to lock this stone sack from the inside. Suddenly, from the depths of the dark warehouse, came a muffled rustle. Someone had stepped on broken glass. The weapons of the whole platoon instantly turned toward the darkness. Bruno clacked the bolt of his rifle, his eyes burning with rage. The enemy was right here, inside our only shelter. We had not managed to lock the doors. I raised my pistol, staring into the dusty shadows between massive racks. Silhouettes in gray uniforms flickered there. An enemy reconnaissance patrol. Take them alive. I barked it before anyone could pull a trigger. Bruno growled, but my men had already rushed into the darkness, knocking the shadows to the floor. A short struggle, dull blows from rifle stocks, choked cries. A minute later, 4 prisoners in gray uniforms were pushed into the center of the lit circle. They were young women. Their equipment screamed elite status: chest radios, field bags, leather map cases with markings and maps. Bruno drew a heavy knife. He looked at them with pure hatred. To him, they were enemy meat that had to pay for the slaughter on the beach. My soldiers surrounded the prisoners. Someone took a rifle off safety. The thirst for blood was tangible. They wanted to shoot them right there in the dust. I stepped forward and stood between Bruno and the girls. The barrel of my pistol pointed straight at the huge sergeant's chest. The warehouse froze in tense silence. You kill them, and then what? I spoke quietly, but each word struck like a hammer. We are 37. The patrol outside will call artillery in 10 minutes. I pointed at the radio operator, who glared at me with hatred from under her brows. They have codes. They have route maps. They have clean bandages and medicine. Bruno clenched his jaw, his knife trembling. The cowardly lieutenant protects enemy girls. He forced the words through his teeth, testing my resolve. I do not care about morality. I lowered the pistol, but did not look away. These 4 scouts are our only ticket to tomorrow. Tie their hands. The girls did not say a word, but their looks spoke better than any interrogation. The tall blonde with the map case looked at me like dirt under her boot. She was a cartographer. I saw the officer compass on her belt and a pencil case. People like her do not go into attacks. They plan routes for assault groups. Beside her sat the radio operator, small, quick, with a massive portable radio on her back. She bit her lip, understanding that her equipment was now in our hands. The third girl was an observer. Her eyes kept moving over our weapons, counting ammunition and judging the physical state of my exhausted men. The fourth clutched a heavy canvas bag with a red cross, a medic, the most valuable resource in a squad where half the men's feet were rotting from icy water. The soldiers reluctantly stepped back, tying their wrists with rough ropes. I could feel authority cracking at the seams. I had saved enemies for my own benefit. They think I am weak, but I looked at those maps and that radio and understood a simple thing. I know history, but only these 4 know the enemy's exact timetable. The tall blonde straightened proudly, even while bound. You are dead men. She said it in the clean and cold dialect of capital aristocracy. Our headquarters already knows about your breakthrough. She smirked, noticing my soldiers shaking hands. In an hour, flamethrower troops will be here. Surrender while you can. I moved close to her. She smelled of gun oil, rain, and cold metal. I silently pulled a folded tactical map of the port city from her pocket. Your headquarters thinks we all died on the beach. I unfolded the paper, scanning the marks. If they knew the truth, heavy shells would already be flying here. I ordered the radio operator placed at her set under guard and told everyone not to touch the transmitter without my order. A proper radio game could not begin in chaos while men trembled from cold and rage. Outside, the footsteps of a patrol were already audible. Inside the warehouse, 40 pairs of eyes waited to see what I would do with the 4 prisoners who could become either our sentence or the only headquarters we did not have. The heavy iron radio stood on the damp concrete floor. Its green tube indicator faintly lit the grim walls of the port warehouse. Behind the doors, the crunch of enemy patrol boots could be heard. Sergeant Bruno breathed heavily, holding his rifle aimed directly at the back of the captive radio operator's head. The other 3 scouts sat by the wall, watching every move I made. They were waiting for my mistake. My own soldiers were waiting too. All 37 surviving landing troops wanted one thing: revenge for the comrades who had died on the beach. I knelt before the radio operator. Her name was Clara. The gray enemy uniform was wet and hung heavily on her shoulders, but the girl was shaking not from cold, but from restrained fury. "Send the clear sector code," I said quietly, taking the code book from her pouch. "Make the patrol move farther down the street, otherwise we all die together." Clara jerked her shoulder, trying to shake off my hand. I sharply pulled my hand back, not letting an awkward motion become a new cause for a fight. She gave me a look full of contempt. "Get your dirty hands off me, barbarian," she hissed through her teeth. "My commanders are not idiots. They will understand the point is captured the moment I go on air. If you do not go on air, the patrol will call artillery straight here," I answered evenly. "Put your hand on the key. Tap out the standard report. No tricks." I untied her right wrist. Clara slowly reached for the telegraph key. Her fingers shook, but she quickly took control of herself. Professional, elite school of the Iron Division. The metal key began beating a dry rhythm. Dot, dash, dot. The sound seemed deafening in the tomb, like silence of the warehouse. Bruno pressed the barrel harder against her neck. I closed my eyes, listening to the tapping. In my old world, I had spent nights studying wartime communications archives. I knew how radio operators worked. Each of them has a hand, a unique rhythm that signalers call a fist. Clara tapped evenly, but on the 5th second her fingers slowed slightly. The pause between two dashes became longer by a fraction of a second. She was hiding a distress signal in non-standard pauses. Her own operators at the other end would immediately understand that she was transmitting under pressure. I seized her wrist, squeezing the thin bone painfully. The transmission stopped. Clara cried out softly in surprise, her eyes widening with fear. "Do you take me for an idiot?" I asked coldly, moving closer. Control group altered. Third symbol delayed. "You are trying to grind us into powder with someone else's hands?" Clara turned pale. She looked at me as if a ghost sat before her. An ordinary infantry lieutenant could not know the subtleties of hidden radio play used by the enemy general staff. "How do you—" she began, but I did not let her finish. "Tap evenly," I ordered, not releasing her wrist. "Tap as if you are sitting in a warm headquarters drinking coffee." One more delay, and I let the sergeant pull the trigger. She swallowed and placed her fingers on the key again. This time, the rhythm was flawless. No extra pauses. The radio station clicked as it received a reply. The speaker hissed. Through the interference broke the sharp metallic voice of the enemy dispatcher. He requested the daily confirmation password. Without it, the report would not be accepted. Clara smiled vengefully, looking directly into my eyes. Her lips barely moved. Silently, she mouthed, "Now you are corpses." I did not know their passwords. It was not in the code book. If we stayed silent, the dispatcher would raise the alarm. There was no time to think. I snatched the microphone from Clara's hands, pressed the switch, and barked into the air in the angriest officer voice I could manage. "What password? 7th node? Our antenna is sparking from damp, and the generator is flooded with seawater. Accept the report as it is before we drown in mud here. End transmission." I threw down the microphone and pulled the power cable. Heavy silence filled the warehouse. Clara stared at me with wide eyes. Bruno nervously tightened his grip on the rifle, waiting for incoming shells. Seconds dragged like hours. We heard the boots of the patrol outside creak. One of them loudly cursed the weather. Then the footsteps began to move away. They believed in the malfunction. The patrol left. The trick with arrogance and complaints about equipment had worked. In every era, staff rats prefer not to deal with angry field commanders in the rain. "Playing games with the enemy will put us in the grave, Lieutenant," Bruno muttered darkly, lowering his weapon. "We were just lucky the dispatcher was a lazy idiot. Next time, they will bury us." I ignored the jab. We had won a breather, but it was only a drop in the sea of our problems. The soldiers began to relax, sinking straight onto the cold concrete floor. The tension faded, and icy cold replaced it. The landing troops had spent hours in seawater. Wind blew through the warehouse cracks, pulling the last warmth from us. One soldier groaned and began pulling off his heavy wet boot. What I saw made me shudder inside. The air instantly filled with the smell of rotting meat. The soldier's foot looked monstrous. The skin had turned corpse white, swollen, and split with deep cracks. In places it had a bluish tint. Every touch caused pain. It was Trenchfoot, a merciless killer of infantry, which cut down armies more effectively than machine guns. Cold and constant moisture destroyed the blood vessels inside living flesh. Several other men followed his example. A wave of painful groans rolled through the warehouse. Nearly 30 men sat on the floor, staring at feet ruined by icy water. I turned and looked at Marlene. The captive medic did not take her eyes off my soldier's rotting feet. Her face showed the pure professional horror of a doctor. Her hostility toward us retreated before mass frost injury. Medical instincts overpowered regulation. I walked to her and cut the ropes from her thin wrists. Marlene rubbed the red marks from the knots with distrust. She looked from me to the groaning soldiers, then adjusted a strand of blonde hair that had slipped from under her cap. "You want me to treat them?" she asked dryly, flexing her fingers. "You killed my comrades on the beach. Why do you think I will not cut off their feet out of revenge?" "Because you are a doctor, not a butcher," I answered calmly. "And because if they cannot walk, we cannot defend this warehouse. Then the patrols will kill all of us together." Marlene pressed her lips, considering my words. Defiance flashed in her eyes. She stepped right up to me, holding my gaze and testing whether I would flinch before her cold boldness. "Your logic is disgusting, Lieutenant," she whispered, looking up at me. "But you are right. Give me my bag, and order your dogs not to twitch when I cut away dead skin." I nodded and handed her the captured medical pouch. Marlene knelt before the first soldier. He instinctively recoiled, but Bruno roughly pinned him against the wall. She worked fast and hard. She cut away the remains of dirty foot wraps and examined the tissue. Her fingers confidently found the zones of damage. At times she clicked her tongue in irritation. "In 10 hours, half your men will lose their toes," Marlene threw over her shoulder. "In a day, wet gangrene begins. You will become a burden to yourselves." Marlene wiped her hands on a dirty rag and stood. Her gaze was unyielding. She gave me a list of demands as if I were a quartermaster in her own hospital. "I need dry bandages. I need clean alcohol or any antiseptic. And most importantly, I need heat. Dry heat, Lieutenant. Otherwise, you may as well shoot them in the head now so they do not suffer." Her defiant tone enraged my landing troops, but I ordered them silent with a gesture. Marlene was absolutely right. Without warmth and drying, we would become a collection of cripples before sunset. "Sergeant Bruno," I called. The huge mustached infantryman came to me, glaring at the medic. "We need fire. Search the warehouse for burnable materials and concealed places." Bruno did not delay. He grabbed a fire axe from the wall and went to the massive wooden columns supporting the roof of the second tier. He swung and struck the old wood. Splinters flew in every direction. Bruno intended to chop load-bearing beams to make a fire in the middle of the warehouse. The soldiers hummed approvingly, anticipating saving warmth. "Stop," I barked so loudly that the echo struck the brick walls. "Drop the axe, Sergeant. Do you want to bury us under the roof or burn us alive?" Bruno slowly lowered the axe. His face reddened with anger. He stepped toward me, looming over me with his bulk. The difference in our height and build made the scene look like a bear meeting a wolf. "My boys are freezing to death, Commander," he growled threateningly. "We need a fire. The wood is dry. We will light it in the center, away from the walls. Nobody will burn." "You forgot about enemy aircraft, Bruno," I replied coldly. "The warehouse is not sealed. Smoke will escape through roof cracks. Air reconnaissance will spot the column within 20 minutes. I walked to the wall and tapped the brickwork. The building was old from the beginning of the century. I knew the architecture of such port terminals from industrial-era blueprints. "If you light an open fire here, bombers will hit us," I continued, addressing everyone. "And if you chop those beams, the roof will simply collapse on our heads." Bruno spat on the floor. His arguments had ended, but his anger remained. The landing troops shook from cold. Teeth chattered on every side. My authority was cracking again. I needed a solution. I began walking the warehouse perimeter, carefully studying the floor. Buildings like this always had ventilation systems for storing perishable cargo. My boot struck an iron grate set into the concrete. I crouched and brought my hand to the grate. A cold but dry draft pulled from it. It smelled of old dust and damp earth. It was not the smell of the sea. It was the smell of deep basement spaces. I took a lighter from my pocket, flicked the wheel, and brought the flame to the grate. The flame sharply bent downward. The draft went underground. Down there were vast voids capable of swallowing any smoke. If we lit fires in the basements, ventilation would distribute the smoke through old collectors. "There is a zero level under us," I announced loudly, standing. "We can hide from shells there and light concealed hearths. Sergeant, find the descent, doors, hatches, freight lifts, move." The order gave the men a purpose. The soldiers, forgetting the pain in their feet, began methodically tapping floors and clearing piles of broken crates. Hope for warmth made them move faster. 5 minutes later, one of the men shouted in joy. In the far corner of the warehouse, under a heap of rotten tarpaulin, we found a double steel door leading underground. I approached the find. The door was massive, covered with a thick layer of rust. There was no lock, but the hinges had fused from sea salt and time. It would not open easily. Bruno gripped the metal handle with both hands. His muscles strained to the limit. He pulled the door toward himself with a growl, but the steel did not even creak. Time was working against us. We need levers, I said, examining the gaps between the leaves. Bring rifles. We use the barrels as crowbars. If we break a couple, we will take weapons from dead enemies. 3 soldiers shoved rifle muzzles into the narrow gap. At my command, they pushed on the stalks together, metal ground. The wood of the stalks cracked dangerously, threatening to split. Push harder, Bruno roared, leaning his shoulder against the door. A little more, damn you, put all your weight into it. Tear those damned hinges out by the roots. The sound of tearing metal echoed through the warehouse. I glanced anxiously at the windows. Such noise could attract enemy patrols outside, but we had no choice. One rifle barrel bent with a loud ring, but the leaf finally gave way. Stale dungeon air poured through the opening. Rusted hinges snapped one after another. The heavy iron door crashed onto the concrete floor. Absolute darkness gaped below. Concrete steps led down into the impenetrable gloom of port catacombs. I took out a flashlight and turned it on, aiming the beam into the abyss. Dust motes danced in the light. The basement seemed endless. It was our only chance to warm ourselves and avoid being killed from the air. Sergeant, take 5 men. We go down to scout, I ordered, checking the chamber of my pistol. The rest hold the perimeter. Do not take your eyes off the prisoners. I stepped into the darkness, feeling the cold underground air wrap around my face. We were going down for warmth, but I did not yet know that this dark staircase would lead us to entirely new resources. Every step echoed hollowly. The survival system of the Anchor District began here, in damp darkness, where we descended not as heroes, but as rats cornered by death. The heavy iron door gave way with a nauseating creak. The air from below struck my face with the smell of ancient mold, rat droppings, and stagnant damp. I stepped first onto slippery stone stairs. The flashlight in my hand pulled massive brick arches from the darkness. Before me opened an old logistics node, forgotten beneath the port. A dozen soldiers descended after me, leaning heavily on rifles. Their feet had turned into pieces of rotting flesh because of icy water. We urgently needed heat. In the far corner, the beam of light slid over neat rows of wooden barrels and dense jute sacks. Sergeant Bruno exhaled hoarsely and rushed forward, forgetting the pain in his feet. A rifle butt knocked the lid off the first crate. Inside were round glass bottles of technical port alcohol and dozens of kilograms of selected coffee beans. The soldiers growled with joy. Someone was already reaching dirty fingers toward a cork, planning to drink himself senseless. Bruno nodded approvingly, anticipating a feast among ruins. I drew my pistol and pulled the slide. The sharp metallic clack echoed through the basement, instantly freezing joy on the filthy faces of exhausted landing troops. Step away from the crates, I ordered evenly. This alcohol goes into burners and medical use. Nobody drinks a drop while we are in the red zone. Bruno stepped toward me threateningly. His massive figure loomed over me. He hissed that the boys deserved rest, and one sip would not kill them after the hell on the beach. I did not argue. Instead, I kicked the nearest open bottle. Glass shattered against stone. Precious, clear liquid began soaking into the dirt. Every word of disobedience will cost you 1 liter, I said coldly. Do you want to die here drunk and with rotting feet? Then keep growling. Dead silence filled the basement. Bruno clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, but stepped back. Pragmatism defeated emotion again. The soldiers grimly began collecting the bottles. I ordered the alcohol poured into flat copper basins and lit. Blue flame caught without a single drop of acrid smoke, the perfect heat source that would not betray us from the air. The captive nurse Marlene looked at me with a strange mixture of contempt and professional respect. I threw her a roll of dry bandages and pointed at the wounded men. She silently knelt before the first landing soldier. Her hands moved fast and precisely. Washing wounds with alcohol made the soldiers scream, but the rot was stopped. Water boiled in mess tins on the neighboring burners. The aroma of strong coffee mixed with the smell of medicine. The soldiers greedily drank hot liquid, and their violent trembling gradually subsided. The base received its first zone of relative comfort. My authority as dictator hardened, but it was too early to relax. A sudden sound destroyed the fragile silence. From the black mouth of a distant tunnel came crying. Not the moan of a wounded soldier, but the thin, piercing voice of a hungry child. The soldiers instantly grabbed their rifles. I took the lamp and went toward the sound, ordering Bruno to cover my back. The tunnel narrowed, turning into an old sewer network. The air here was much warmer and drier. The light pulled a barricade of old mattresses and rusty pipes from the darkness. Behind it hid dozens of emaciated people in rags, local port loaders and their families. A full-figured woman in a worn velvet coat stepped forward. A ring of copper keys clanged heavily at her belt. This was Madame Lucy, the unofficial mistress of these underground passages. She held an old revolver, clearly ready to use it. Lucy dryly ordered the soldiers to leave her sector and stop attracting artillery fire to her people. I quickly assessed the situation. They had no weapons, but they had keys to every technical passage in the district. More importantly, they had hidden food supplies in basement niches. "We do not need your lives," I answered, lowering the lamp. "We need passage and food. In exchange, I offer protection from gray uniforms and hot coffee right now." Madame Lucy smirked, looking over my filthy uniform. She offered a more interesting deal. 10 strong workers and 1 crate of food, only if my soldiers do not touch her people and do not enter their shelters without permission. The captive cartographer Erica, standing behind me, snorted quietly. She whispered sarcastically that the lieutenant was too boring for such simple human pleasures. I ignored the joke. "The only romance I care about right now is the thickness of the ceiling over our heads," I answered Lucy. "Keep your girls with you. We take the keys and divide the territory." Lucy nodded reluctantly, understanding that bargaining with a wall was useless. She threw me a heavy key to the lower collector, but her face suddenly became utterly serious. She warned me not to go down to the 3rd tier. According to her, water constantly seeped through old brick there, and the walls might collapse from any loud sound. That detail instantly hooked onto my historical knowledge. I left Bruno to manage the supply exchange and went into the forbidden zone myself to test the theory. The 3rd tier met me with Arctic cold and hollow echoes. The air here was saturated with moisture. The flashlight reflected from puddles on the uneven stone floor of the old drain. I found the wall Lucy had mentioned. Before me stood a giant supporting bulkhead of the old city aqueduct, built a century earlier. The red brick surface was covered with thick slime. Water was not merely seeping, it was being forced through microscopic cracks under enormous pressure. I took out an army knife and carefully picked at the mortar between the bricks. It yielded far too easily. Constant damp had turned the mortar into soft clay. A thin stream of salt water struck me in the face with the force of a hydraulic press. I barely managed to jerk back. The pressure in that old reservoir was colossal. The ocean tide pressed on the hidden walls with such force that one rough blow could turn the lower tier into a death trap. For now, it was a danger, not a solution. I returned to the stairs and whistled for the sergeant. Bruno came down, muttering irritably about endless running through dark wet holes instead of normal open battle. I ordered him to take 5 of the strongest men and reinforce that wall with 3 rows of sandbags. Bruno stared at me like I was insane, refusing to understand the order. He said we were not dam builders. I answered harshly that if that mortar washed out completely, we would all drown in mud before enemy infantry even arrived. The sergeant spat, but went to do it. The threat of drowning in a basement frightened him more than bullets. Soldiers began hauling heavy wet bags, strengthening the dangerous sector. I was not going to argue with water. I only needed to win time and remember this strange weakness of the city. In Port Verona, even stone was held together by a promise. While the men strained their backs, I returned to the upper camp. The situation had stabilized a little. The wounded slept warm beside the burners, while others cleaned rifle bolts. The captive girls sat in a corner under guard by 2 men. Marlene tiredly wiped her hands with a rag. She had done all our poor shared medical supplies allowed. I poured hot coffee into a metal mug and offered it to her. Marlene looked at me suspiciously, expecting a trick, but accepted the mug with frozen fingers. "This does not change the fact that you are occupiers," she said quietly, taking a scalding sip. I nodded dryly. My task was not to be liked by her, but to preserve a working resource. We had managed to create the first warm island amid dampness, but above us the city still lived by the laws of war. A sharp metallic knock sounded in the ventilation pipe. Lotta from the upper post was sending an alarm. From the street came a heavy clanking, too even for a truck and too slow for infantry. Armor was approaching our shelter. The heavy rumble made brick dust fall from the ceiling. The ground under our feet trembled, beating the rhythm of approaching death. I gestured for every man to lie still and not move. The sound was too even for a truck. The clank of steel wheels on broken pavement echoed through the narrow street. Heavy armor was coming, and against it we had only bolt-action rifles. I carefully looked through the narrow gap of a boarded window. A massive silhouette emerged from gray fog. An enemy armored car slowly crawled between the wreckage like a predator sniffing for prey in ruins. Its frontal armor was sloped at a sharp angle. A clumsy turret with a machine gun rotated on the roof. But worst of all was the thick flamethrower hose protruding from the armored front port. A stream of roaring flames struck the neighboring ruined house. The street instantly filled with unbearable heat. It smelled of burned dry wood, melted resin, and acrid chemical smoke. Sergeant Bruno reached for his last grenade. In his eyes burned the stubborn rage of a veteran who would rather die attacking than burn alive. I caught his broad hand hard. I hissed directly into the sergeant's ear that he must not even think of heroics. An ordinary fragmentation grenade would only scratch the paint on that steel monster. In response, they would pour liquid fire over us. Bruno ground his teeth in fury, but removed his hand from the fuse. We pressed ourselves into the filthy floor, sweating. Heat penetrated the thick walls, raising the air inside our shelter to the limit. The vehicle crawled with irritating slowness. Because of the global rubber shortage in this world, vehicle wheels were often plated with steel. Every turn of the axle came with infernal scraping. I kept studying the armored car through the gap. My brain feverishly sifted through historical archives of similar conflicts. Early vehicles like this had one critical flaw, and I found it. The problem was visibility. The driver saw the world through narrow viewing slits only a couple of fingers wide. He saw only what lay directly ahead. At the sides, the armored car was blind. I crawled away from the window into the room. We had to blind this turtle and rob it of movement. We had no magic and no explosives, but we had the urban environment. I ordered the soldiers to prepare smoke grenades and assemble on the second floor of the building. I needed heavy and flexible material, something bullets would not easily cut and mechanisms would wind around. I descended into the damp basements where the locals hid. Madame Lucy sat on a wooden crate, lazily smoking a thin cigarette. Her sharp gaze moved over my uniform appraisingly. I told her directly that a flamethrower vehicle was roaming above. If the armored car found our shelter, fire would move through the ventilation straight here. Soldiers would burn first, but the locals would choke after them. Lucy slowly flicked ash onto the dirty concrete. She asked what exactly the officer wanted from simple port women. I demanded keys to the storehouse with old fishing nets. Her thin eyebrows rose in surprise. She had expected soldiers to ask for cartridges or medicine. Searching for fishing gear in the middle of urban battle seemed like an absurd joke. One of her girls gave a bold giggle in the darkness. She made a spicy joke about the size of my catch and advised me to look for fish in the sea. I answered dryly that I intended to catch a steel shark. Lucy appreciated my cold tone. She took a rusty keyring from her belt and threw it to me. At the end, she warned that the port nets weighed like a dead sailor because of the lead sinkers. That was exactly what I needed. I gathered 10 strong men from the platoon. We tore the lock from the far door. A thick smell of rotting seaweed and damp lead hit the nose. The nets really were enormous. Thick hemp ropes were woven into a strong mesh structure. Heavy lead weights were sewn permanently into the edges for rapid sinking to the bottom. The soldiers grunted, trying to lift the mass. Bruno cursed, saying we were landing troops, not port loaders. I answered that if he wanted to survive, today he would have to become a fisherman. We dragged the dirty nets upward. Heavy lead thudded on the wooden stairs. Men slipped on stairs wet with seaweed, scraping their palms bloody against rough ropes. We hauled the gear to the second floor of a building hanging directly over the narrow alley. It was the perfect drop point, but for the trap to work, I needed perfect timing. I looked at Lotta. The captive enemy observer sat in a corner with bound hands. Her gray uniform was stained with whitewash. I walked to her and cut the ropes on her feet. Lotta flinched and pressed against the wall. In her eyes were fear mixed with contempt. I roughly lifted her by the shoulder and dragged her to the window, ordering her to watch the approaching vehicle. She asked sarcastically why she should help the enemy destroy equipment of her own empire. I pointed at the fuel tanks on the armored car. If we miscalculated, the whole street would go up. I told her that not only my platoon would burn in that fire, but she would as well. Her command would not sort out who was inside the barricaded house. To them, we were all simply meat in the ruins. Lotta swallowed with a dry throat. Her breathing faltered, but her gaze became cold and precise. Pragmatism defeated ideology. She nodded and narrowed her eyes in the practiced manner of an observer judging a target. The armored car roared into our alley. There was so little space here that the steel wheels scraped along the brick walls on either side. The vehicle had entered a perfect trap. 24 of my soldiers held the edges of the heavy net at the windowsill. The muscles in their arms shook from strain. Lead dragged the mesh downward, ready to fall on the first command. Lotta pressed her shoulder against my arm. I could feel her heart hammer. She professionally counted the tempo of the armor and the moment when the vehicle entered the blind zone under the window. The armored car driver suspected nothing. He slowly drove forward, searching for targets through the narrow slit. The machine gunner in the turret lazily swept the barrel from side to side. Lotta began the countdown in a fast whisper. 3 meters, 2 meters, 1 meter. She exhaled sharply and shouted right into my ear to drop the damned load. I blew hard into the officer whistle. The men released the edges together. The huge lead-weighted net fell from the second floor and covered the front of the heavy armored car. The impact was dull and heavy. The lead weights wrapped around the sloped armor. Wet ropes plastered over the viewing slits, and the lower edge of the net went under the front wheels. The driver panicked and hit the gas, pulling the trap deeper himself. A terrible metallic crunch sounded. The armored car jerked, lost control, and stopped crosswise in the narrow alley, roaring helplessly. I shouted for Bruno to launch the smoke bait. A few seconds later, a thick cloud rose around the hull, and the crew began choking inside their own steel box. The steel monster could no longer see or move. Blind and confused because of the net and smoke, the turret gunner pressed the trigger. Large caliber bullets began randomly tearing the walls of our building. We dropped to the floor, covering our heads. Lead pierced the brickwork through and through. Behind me, in the next room, I heard wood shatter and metal tear with ringing sounds. The burst lasted 15 long seconds. Then the belt ran dry. From inside the armored car came a choking cough. The suffocating crew threw open the upper armored hatches. Bruno was there instantly. He jumped from the ledge straight onto the turret. The heavy stock of his rifle came down on the helmet of the enemy machine gunner. The other soldiers covered the hatches with rifles. 3 enemy soldiers climbed out, raising their hands and spitting acrid smoke. We had captured an elite armored vehicle without a single gram of explosives, using only rope and friction. My men shouted with joy. It was a rare tactical victory, for which we immediately paid with a new shortage. When I turned and looked into the next room, an unpleasant chill ran down my back. The machine gunner's blind burst had pierced the wall exactly where we had stacked the remnants of our provisions. The wooden crates were blown to splinters. Cans of hard biscuits and stew had become pulp. Tomato paste mixed with brick dust and machine oil. I came closer and lifted a twisted piece of tin. All our food, meant for 40 men, was destroyed.
You know the greatest irony of war? You can brilliantly outplay the system and capture a steel monster with bare hands. But if a random bullet hits your last crate of food, by evening, you are all still corpses. Without calories, soldiers do not fight. They simply die slowly.
The euphoria of my soldiers vanished as quickly as it had appeared. They stared at the dirty slurry on the floor. Hunger cramped their stomachs. We had won the fight but lost logistics. Bruno grimly kicked a punctured can. He forced through his teeth that iron from the captured machine gun could not be spread on bread. The platoon was exhausted. In a couple of hours, men would begin fainting. We had an excellent heavy machine gun taken from the turret and a crate of captured medicine, but there were exactly 0 calories in our camp. I ordered Bruno to take position at the window. I had to go back down to the locals in the basements. Madame Lucy already knew about our victory. The sounds of the stalled engine and the prisoners' cries had traveled through every pipe of the old district. I approached her improvised table. One of her women immediately slid toward me, playfully adjusting a dress strap. She purred something about heroes needing rest. I coldly moved the girl aside without changing expression. My eyes met Lucy's. I silently threw 3 first aid kits taken from the captured enemy armored car onto her table. Lucy appraised the clean bandages and morphine ampules with her fingertips. In this city's black market, such things were worth more than gold. She understood perfectly why I had come with such a gift. She leaned forward. Her dress slipped slightly, revealing pale skin. Lucy asked in a quiet velvet voice how many lives those lovely white bandages were worth. I did not fall for the provocation. I answered hard and to the point. I needed canned food, enough to feed 40 exhausted soldiers. Otherwise, there would be no one to defend her underground passages. Lucy smirked. She reminded me that her people needed food too. I countered that the captured large-caliber machine gun now guarded the main entrance to her quarter. It was a fair price. She snapped her fingers. 2 loaders emerged from the darkness. They carried out 3 heavy crates of port stew and dried beans. We shook hands. My army had received fuel. I ordered the men to bring the food to the first floor and distribute rations immediately. The soldiers fell upon the cans with the greed of starving wolves. They had to chew dry beans with almost no water. While the platoon recovered strength, I approached the captive girls. Erica sat in the corner, legs crossed in torn stockings. She methodically brushed brick dust from her gray uniform. She looked at the chewing landing troops with clear disgust. An aristocrat to the bone, she saw only wild barbarians in us. But her analytical mind never stopped working. Erica caught my eye. Her lips bent into an icy smirk. Quietly, she said my deal for food had been a completely meaningless waste of time and valuable resources. I came closer and asked what she meant. Erica nodded toward her broken chronometer. She said that by regulation, their destroyed armored car should have reported in 3 minutes ago. She calmly explained General Steiner's logic. If a patrol vehicle does not answer a request, the square is immediately marked on headquarters maps as a captured red zone. The smile vanished from her face. Erica lowered her voice to a threatening whisper. She told me that in exactly 20 minutes, their heavy howitzers would begin wiping this quarter from the face of the earth. My blood froze. We were sitting in a building that was about to become a mass grave of broken brick. We had to leave urgently, but without her map of safe routes, we were blind. The timer began its merciless countdown. Exactly 20 minutes remained before the first volleys of enemy heavy artillery. I looked at the hands of the captured watch and understood that our time was spilling away fast. The headquarters of the Iron Division never forgave losses. They had lost an advanced patrol and a heavy flamethrower armored car in this quarter. Their command doctrine required them to erase the problem sector. The old red brick port warehouse trembled in the wind. The building was strong but entirely unsuited for protection from howitzer shells. One direct hit, and the roof would collapse onto our heads. I turned to Erica. The enemy reconnaissance cartographer stood against a cold brick wall. Her gray elite uniform was stained with soot and oil, but she held her back unnaturally straight, defending her pride. Erica pressed the leather map case to her chest. Inside was a detailed city map with all hidden routes and underground communications. But the map was encrypted with a complex staff code. We urgently needed to leave this square. I stepped toward her, closing the distance. My order to reveal a safe route shattered against her icy stare, full of open contempt. To her, I was just a dirty barbarian, a pathetic landing soldier who had somehow survived the bloody meat grinder on the beach and now dared give orders to an aristocrat. She sincerely believed in the superiority of her army. "You will all turn to ash," Erica said coldly. "General Steiner's heavy guns leave no empty zones. If I reveal a safe square to you, you will simply drag me down with you." I exhaled heavily, feeling blood pulse in my temples. Behind me, Sergeant Bruno threateningly worked the bolt of his rifle. His men were tired of fear and ready to beat information out with rifle stocks. I sharply raised my hand, forbidding any violence from my soldiers. Torture would not work here. Erica was a fanatic of rigid logic. Her will could be broken only by undeniable mathematical facts. "Your headquarters believes the Central City Hall stands on solid rock," I said quietly. She nodded confidently. It was their main bunker, the place they planned to retreat to under threat. "If you run there, a perfect death awaits you," I continued. 300 years ago, a network of stone aqueducts was laid under the City Hall foundation. Time, damp, and sea salt have long eaten the supports. Erica froze. I saw thoughts begin racing in her eyes. She was a brilliant cartographer and knew the city's construction history. My words struck exactly the weakest point of her praised defense. "2 howitzer hits in the neighboring quarter will create seismic resonance," I added harshly. "The soil will sink. Your entire stone city hall will fold like a house of cards and bury you alive in the dark." Her fingers trembled. Pride collided with basic self-preservation. Erica realized that if she followed her own command doctrine, she would be killed by the shells of her own artillerymen. She slowly opened the map case. Her icy mask cracked. Erica wiped dust from the protective plastic and pointed with a thin finger to another square of the map. The wine cellars behind the old tram depot. It was the only place with vaults thick enough. I turned to Bruno and began giving quick orders. "We leave every unnecessary crate. We take only ammunition, the remaining medicine, and canteens of water." Madame Lucy tried to object. The shadow mistress of the basements began shouting that her civilians would not leave their bundles. People in panic grabbed useless pots and old winter coats. I knocked a heavy bundle from a loader's hands. "Either you throw away this junk and run light, or your bones stay forever under these bricks." My voice broke into a shout over the rumble of wind. The argument ended with a deafening whistle from the sky. The first ranging shell hit the roof of the neighboring warehouse hangar. The powerful shockwave knocked us down, shattering the remaining windows in our shelter. The air instantly filled with choking brick dust and the smell of burning explosive. We rushed toward the rear exit. Going into the street seemed like suicide, but staying inside was even more terrifying. Thick gray smoke from explosions covered the port streets. It was our only chance to survive. Enemy observers on the hills could not see our movement through that dense curtain of dirt and soot. We ran in short dashes from crater to crater. Marlene caught the arm of a wounded landing soldier while running. The captive nurse worked on pure reflex, dragging her recent enemy from under fire. Lotta moved at the front of the column. Her eyes constantly scanned surviving roofs and dark windows. The sharp gaze of the observer searched for glints from enemy optics. Now her skills saved our lives. We burst onto the wide open space of Central Boulevard. Once it had been the main transport artery of the port city. Now each heavy step I took returned a strange vibrating hum from below. I stopped abruptly, looking under my boots. The thick layer of old asphalt had sagged downward. Its surface was covered with a deep spiderweb of cracks. From underground came the muffled but powerful roar of a raging current. The old city collector could not handle the pressure of the ocean tide. Water was slowly washing soil away beneath the boulevard. I fixed this important engineering anomaly firmly in memory. A void beneath our feet hid a threat. Another explosion tore the silence behind us. Hot fragments whistled into the facades of ruined shops, striking showers of sparks. One civilian fell, but the strong hands of landing soldiers lifted him. We turned into a narrow service alley. Massive, rusty gates of the old wine cellars rose before us. Bruno struck the padlock twice with a heavy rifle butt. The iron crunched and gave way. People poured in a solid stream into the saving, cool darkness. The walls here were more than a meter thick. Artillery roared above, the earth shook, but the stone vaults of the cellars did not even think of crumbling. Erica had been absolutely right. This underground shelter could withstand a direct blow from the sky, but thick darkness brought a new surge of animal fear. 80 people were trapped in total blackness. Children began to cry. Soldiers breathed heavily and hoarsely, trying to calm pounding hearts. The vast cellar space was divided into dozens of isolated compartments with thick partitions. We were safe from shells, but became completely blind and deaf. If enemy infantry entered these labyrinths, we would not even be able to coordinate fire. Scattered groups would be killed one by one. Without reliable communication, our new base was simply a very comfortable mass grave. I lit a kerosene lamp. The yellow beam pulled rows of empty oak barrels and old ventilation grates under the ceiling from the dark. In the far corner of the compartment, a forgotten construction reel glittered. I came closer and brushed away dust. It was a coil of excellent thick copper wire in rubber insulation. An engineering idea flared instantly. I loudly called our young signalman Jurgen and the captive radio operator Clara. We had exactly 3 captured field telephones. We urgently needed to run copper cable through the old shafts. Clara looked at me with clear confusion. She was used to radio. Using wires seemed like an ancient relic to her. She suggested simply tuning the radios to short waves. "The radio spectrum is fully controlled by the enemy right now," I answered harshly. "Any signal gives away our coordinates. Only copper gives us a closed and reliable channel. We link the 3 main nodes of our underground. Marlene's infirmary, the ammunition store, and our defensive perimeter had to work in synchrony. No blind zones." Clara bit her lip, but nodded. She understood that without communication, we were doomed. The main problem was the route. Ventilation pipes went upward, passing through the first above-ground level. There stood the abandoned tram depot. We had to send people above. Bruno took 2 of the strongest landing soldiers and the wire coil. I went with them. We carefully climbed a spiral cast-iron staircase. The air above was bitter with smoke and smelled of rusty iron. The old depot building stood on the very top of a steep hill. Inside, gray twilight ruled. Dull light fell through huge holes in the shattered roof. 4 tram cars stood frozen on warped rails. They were huge, rusted, and unbelievably heavy. I slowly approached the nearest car. The brake pads had long since rotted and fallen off. The cars were held on the slope only by cast iron wheel blocks. I looked down through the depot's broken gates. A narrow street ran sharply downhill straight toward our new underground shelter. Hundreds of tons of dead iron were simply waiting for one good hammer blow. Gravity always works reliably. A clear engineering blueprint of a future catastrophe began forming in my head. If heavy enemy armor dared enter that street, we would be ready. Bruno began unrolling the wire. We threw the heavy cable over ceiling beams so shrapnel would not sever the line. We dropped the wire ends back into the dark mouths of the ventilation wells. Copper lay in years of dust, binding our fractured underground world together. We descended back into the cellars. Jurgen quickly stripped the wire ends with a sharp knife, preparing the contacts. Clara helped him attach the terminals to the captured set. Her thin fingers moved confidently and professionally. She no longer tried to resist or sabotage my orders. She had understood a simple truth. Inside this clear system, she was under reliable protection. Above, blind fire from her own artillery awaited her. Here, she was a priceless military specialist. I sharply turned the dynamo handle on the side of the telephone set. Current ran through the copper conductors. I lifted the heavy ebonite receiver and pressed it firmly to my ear. Pleasant static crackled in the speaker. Second post. How do you hear me? I said loudly into the round microphone. A second of silence felt like eternity. Then the hoarse voice of a landing soldier broke through light interference. I hear you clearly. Infirmary online. I exhaled loudly, feeling tension leave my shoulders. Our base had come alive. Cold ruins were gradually turning into a living organism, where every wire, corridor, and person had a function. The new bloodstream of copper wires pulsed with information. I turned to my exhausted people. From this moment, we call our fortress Anchor Node. No chaos, no independent action. Every action goes through line report. Remaining water and food are distributed strictly through Central Post. Madame Lucy nodded in agreement. The Shadow Mistress recognized my absolute authority in these walls. Her civilians quickly began arranging sleeping places on empty wooden crates. Marlene set up the infirmary near the warmest ventilation shaft. Lotta climbed to the upper post. The system worked. Then the phone on the defensive perimeter post rang. The sound cut through the air like a knife. I picked up the receiver. Bruno's voice was low and tense. Enemy infantry is approaching the old cellars. Ammunition remained for exactly 2 minutes of dense firefight. I looked at the empty cartridge tins in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. Without rifle fire in response, our basement would become a huge mass grave. Erica moved a dirty finger over the unfolded diagram of city communications. She pointed to a spacious room directly above our wine cellars. There was the repair ring of the tram depot. I took Bruno and 5 of the strongest men in the platoon. We climbed a narrow service staircase and tore off the rusty inner lock. The sharp smell of machine oil and old dust struck my nose. The enormous workshop was filled with abandoned lathes and heavy workbenches. It was a real jackpot. I could not create weapons from thin air, but I knew exactly how to organize a repair line. Madame Lucy brought a dozen of her best people from among the refugees. Yesterday's port mechanics stood at the cold machines. Belt drives creaked with strain, bringing the dead metal of this city back to life. We launched a real repair line right under the enemy's nose. Mechanics cleaned jammed bolts, fixed telephones, assembled stretchers, reinforced helmets, and returned to life anything that could still serve. Broken weapons were not turned into miracles. They were stripped for parts, useful mechanisms were taken, and from them several reliable defensive points were built for narrow corridors. Dangerous, damaged ammunition was stacked separately and no longer touched without need. After one loud misfire, I ordered strict accounting. In our workshop, any carelessness cost fingers, eyes, and the entire base. The air in the depot was unbearably stifling. Clara sat by the radio with her collar open, fanning herself with a piece of cardboard, trying not to pass out from heat and exhaustion. Several of my soldiers lost the rhythm of work, staring at the captive radio operator instead of the machines. I coughed dryly and ordered the men to remember that beauty would not kill them. Inattention would. Clara smiled like a predator and handed me an overheated radio tube. I took it through a rag, not allowing her to turn the men's fatigue into a new mistake. From the corner, Erica coldly remarked that the radio operator should wiggle less. The cartographer added dryly that sudden movements might accidentally twist someone's neck. Clara only snorted in answer. The atmosphere eased a little, but our problems did not end there. We catastrophically lacked thick boards to reinforce the main western tunnel. Without them, the barricade would not survive an assault. I went down to the lower level in the refugee sector. People had built themselves miserable imitations of cozy rooms from old wooden crates and pallets. I ordered the guards to dismantle those walls for construction materials. It seemed crystal clear to me. Why did they need private space if in a couple of hours assault troops would break in and burn everyone with flamethrowers? The boards were needed for the survival of the whole base. But when Sergeant Bruno swung a sledgehammer at the first partition, a crowd poured from the corridors. About 100 exhausted people blocked our way. In their sunken eyes was only dull hatred. Madame Lucy stepped forward. She clenched her fists so hard that the joints of her fingers turned white. The woman quietly asked how exactly my regime differed from the occupation of enemy forces in gray uniforms. I tried to explain the mathematics of survival to her. I spoke about angles of fire, barricade strength, and the kinetic energy of bullets. But Lucy simply spat on the dirty concrete floor in front of my boots. She said people would not defend a place where they were considered ordinary expendable material. The crowd behind her stepped forward threateningly. Wrenches and rusty pipes flashed in refugee hands. My perfect tactical plan shattered against stubborn human nature. I had to cancel the order. We agreed to reinforce only the load-bearing doors and leave the fragile partitions intact. The conflict was over, but the argument cost us 3 precious hours. The barricade of the West Wing remained weak. I did not yet suspect how terrible the price of that compromise would be. Enemy infantry appeared on the street exactly at noon. Gray uniforms moved with extreme caution. They checked every dark corner of the ruins, but I strictly forbade my men to return fire. We had too few real bullets for an open firefight. A deadly game of hide-and-seek began. Thin local boys crawled through ventilation pipes, gripping long, strong ropes. In the empty, ruined building opposite our depot, a pile of old iron and buckets collapsed with a terrible crash. The enemy vanguard immediately turned and poured 50 precious automatic rounds into it. They were shooting trash. We created false positions wherever we could. Soldiers stuffed sacks with rotten straw and threw torn greatcoats from dead enemies over them. In twilight, it looked very convincing. A sack with a stick tied to it made the enemy waste grenades. Infantry threw charges into empty rooms. Fragments chewed brick, thick dust clogged lungs. The attackers' formation quickly broke in that chaos. Sappers in gray uniforms began striking picks directly into the wall beside our workshop. Clara sat at the radio and intercepted their commander's frequencies. She distorted orders, sending units along false routes. The enemy wandered through a labyrinth of noise and deception. The base worked like a clock. By evening, the sun began sinking behind the roofs of the ruined port. Long shadows covered the streets. The enemy stopped firing and pulled back. According to every classic tactical textbook, the time for night regrouping had come. I wiped sticky sweat from my face and ordered tired watches on the eastern wing relieved. The men were holding together by willpower alone. 10 minutes of complete silence felt like a real gift after a whole day of deafening thunder. And that was my most fatal mistake. I judged an experienced enemy by old academic schemes from books. Assault units in gray uniforms did not care about any textbooks. They used the loud bootsteps of our guard change to hide their approach. The enemy began a concealed bypass from the weakest flank. Lada sat on an old water tower high above the base. The captive sniper watched the empty street through optics. Suddenly, she noticed strange movement of dark silhouettes in our blind zone. She could easily have stayed silent and waited for her own soldiers, but then this quarter would have been burned with flamethrowers along with her. Lada yanked the thick bell cord, tearing apart my fatal silence with a loud ringing. We were exactly 1 minute late. The enemy assault team struck directly at the joint of our weakened barricade. The very wall for which I had lacked wood because of the morning dispute with Madame Lucy. Cold logic struck me straight in the face. A brutal close fight erupted. Bayonets, heavy entrenching tools, and rifle stocks came into use. In the narrow stone passage, the stink of iron and blood was unbearable. We threw the attackers back beyond the perimeter at incredible cost, but on the cold, flooded floor lay young signalman Jurgen. His chest had been pierced, and his breath escaped with a terrible whistle. Bruno threw the wounded boy over his broad shoulder and carried him down to the infirmary. I ran after him. I felt sticky red sludge dripping from the stretcher onto the concrete and leaving tracks on my boots. Medic Marlene met us with an absolutely pale face. Jurgen wheezed on an old wooden table. The captive nurse pressed the wound with bare, shaking hands. Her fingers slid over blood-soaked skin. She had almost no clean bandages or antiseptic left. Marlene shouted at me, demanding bright light and boiling water. She ordered me to clamp the torn artery. I had to thrust my hands into that hot wound. Nausea rose to my throat like a heavy lump. I'd been a historian all my life. I was used to dry casualty numbers on archival paper, but now a real person was dying from blood loss under my dirty hands. And the main reason for that horror was my own miscalculation of time. I stood aside while Marlene did the impossible without instruments. By morning, Jurgen's breathing evened out. He survived by miracle and the medic's will.
Do you think cunning and a couple of empty tin cans can stop a regular army forever? It works well against tired infantry, but when illusions disperse, steel arrives.
Dawn fog slowly melted under gusts of icy wind from the sea. I was sitting by the field telephone when a loud broken ring sounded. It was Lada again from her upper observation post. Her voice trembled noticeably from intense strain. She did not waste seconds on ciphers or complicated regulations. The captive sniper reported briefly that tanks were coming down the central street toward us. Heavy tracked vehicles crawled relentlessly toward our shelter. My restored rifles were absolutely powerless against thick frontal armor. Ingenuity alone could not stop that metal. The morning fog vibrated with a low, monotonous hum. Dust fell from the brick vaults of the basement directly onto our heads. The earth shook underfoot so strongly that puddles rippled with tiny waves. Lada slid down the fire ladder from the roof. Her face was smeared with soot, and her breath broke. 3 heavy tanks of the Iron Division have entered our square, she reported, catching her breath. Rifles against frontal armor were useless. Our improvised barricade tools could only slow the tracks, not stop tanks. I looked at the exhausted faces of my soldiers, understanding the full weight of our position. Suddenly, from the direction of the docks came the noise of boat engines. The guards at the barricades raised weapons, then immediately lowered the barrels. Allied reinforcements had arrived by water. A fresh infantry company. A captain stepped from the first boat onto the dirty pier. His uniform was perfectly clean, and his high boots gleamed. He stepped with disgust over a puddle of fuel oil, examining our soot-black port ruins. The captain came to me and, in a cold tone, demanded that command of the district be transferred to him immediately. He had an order from headquarters and a full company of rested soldiers who looked at us with contempt. He swept his gaze over our positions. The sandbags and windows caused only mockery. "You have buried yourselves in dirt like moles," he declared loudly so everyone could hear. "Real soldiers do not fight like this." Then his gaze fell on the captive girls. Clara was carrying a coil of cable, and Marlene was sorting clean bandages. The captain's face reddened with rage. He called them enemy trash and reached for his holster. I stepped forward, blocking his path. I explained dryly that without these specialists, our communications node would go blind, and the wounded would die of blood poisoning. These prisoners work for us and save your lives. The captain sprayed spit, calling me a traitor to regulation. He ordered his men to disarm my sentries. My veterans grimly tightened their grips on rifles, but I raised my hand, signaling them not to resist. Open conflict right now would kill us faster than tanks. I stepped back, allowing the captain to take power. He immediately gave the stupidest order, to drive people out of the deep basements and form them outside. The tune system of the anchor district collapsed in 10 minutes. The captain tore off camouflage nets because he wanted to see his straight ranks. He forbade noise decoys, considering them cowardice. Clara lost access to the radio. In her place sat the captain's signalman, who began tapping open messages into the air. He had just given our exact coordinates to every enemy artilleryman in the district. Madame Lucy tried to lead civilians deeper underground, but the captain's patrols blocked the stairs. They demanded that loaders dig straight trenches on open asphalt under the sights of tanks. I found Sergeant Bruno in the far wing of the depot. He spat angrily on the floor watching this circus. "They are all dead men," Bruno growled, gripping his heavy sledgehammer in huge hands. I nodded silently. We could not stop the tank attack with rifles, but I had a reserve plan. I ordered Bruno to take crowbars and move secretly to the top of the steep hill where the old tram depot stood. Erica noticed our movement and slipped after us through the shadow of ruined walls. She was too smart to stay below with the mad captain. Her survival instinct led her to me again. We climbed into the dark depot. On rusty rails stood 4 enormous freight tram cars. Their bodies were filled to the top with heavy construction stone and cast iron beams from an old port repair. The street ran sharply downhill from the depot, turning into a narrow chute between stone houses. If the brakes were released, those thousands of tons of iron would fly down with immense speed, sweeping away everything in their path. Bruno and I began striking the jammed stops with crowbars. The metal creaked and refused to yield. At that moment, heavy footsteps sounded outside. The captain's patrol was climbing to the depot to check the perimeter. I grabbed Erica by the sleeve, and the two of us jumped into a narrow inspection pit directly under the first tram car. Bruno managed to dissolve into the darkness behind the far load-bearing column. There was critically little space in the pit. Erica fell beside me, hitting her shoulder against a rusty beam. I pressed her to the floor not from closeness, but so the patrol would not notice movement beneath the car. I covered her mouth with my palm for exactly 1 second while boots passed above our heads. She flashed angry eyes at me in the gloom, and I immediately removed my hand so fear would not become noise. The captain's soldiers passed right over us, hobnailed boots striking the rails. One stopped to adjust his belt, and his boot hung 2 inches from Erica's frozen face. When the steps faded, Erica shoved my hand away and whispered that my heart was pounding like a terrified cadet's. I answered dryly that it was simply the time calculation until the tanks died. I said dryly that it was oxygen shortage and climbed out. She pulled herself up after me with grace, brushing dust from her knees. Bruno emerged from the shadows, continuing methodically to knock wedges from the wheels. From below came the piercing sound of a bugle. The captain had formed his fresh company in straight ranks right in the middle of the wide avenue. He drew saber and revolver, preparing for an epic frontal attack. 3 heavy enemy tanks crawled from the morning fog. Their turrets slowly turned, taking aim at the dense Allied formation. This was not war, it was a public mass execution. I ran down the slope, jumping over debris. I shouted to the captain, begging him to scatter the men into cellars and strike at the tracks from cover. "You will simply kill them all for a pretty picture," the captain spat contemptuously at my feet. He called me a cowardly rat used to hiding behind women's skirts. He turned away and raised his saber, giving the order to advance. I sharply turned to my veterans. The anchor dogs looked at me with hope. I ordered them to stay in cover behind sandbags and not dare stick themselves into the line of fire. The captain's company charged forward with cries of hurrah toward the armored vehicles. The defenders of the Empire did not even stop the tanks. They simply opened hurricane fire from paired hull machine guns. The first line of allies ceased to exist in 3 seconds. Men fell into the mud, cut down by heavy bullets. Screams of pain drowned the sound of engines. The tanks coldly continued crawling forward. The soldiers tried to stop armor with bayonets and rifle stocks, but steel felt no pain. The bloodbath paralyzed the remnants of the fresh company. Panic instantly broke their neat, beautiful formation. The captain's surviving soldiers threw down rifles and ran in blind horror. They rushed up the slope straight toward our depot. The tanks gained speed, wanting to crush the retreating men on the narrow street. I stood at the edge of cover with clenched teeth. Erica tensely followed the stopwatch in her head. I waited until the last fleeing soldier crossed the control line of broken brick on the asphalt. The tanks entered the chute of the street, engines roaring. Their guns were raised upward. The last fugitive jumped over the line and fell, spent. The trap closed. I raised my hand and sharply dropped it. Bruno at the top of the hill struck the main lever with a sledgehammer. The stop sprang away with a vile scream. 4 heavy tram cars loaded with stone broke loose and rolled down the rails. The slope was incredibly steep. The cars gained terrifying speed in mere seconds. Steel wheels threw fountains of sparks. The thunder of rolling metal drowned even tank engines. The tank commanders understood their mistake too late. They tried to reverse but had no room to turn in the narrow street. The enormous kinetic mass flew inevitably straight into their front. The first tram car slammed into the lead tank with deafening grinding. The impact was so powerful that the tank turret tore off its ring and flew into a building wall. Thick frontal armor crumpled like cheap foil. The second and third cars smashed into the next vehicle, turning the steel monster into a flattened heap of burning scrap. Stones flew from the car bodies, finishing off accompanying enemy infantry. The street became a giant scrapyard of destroyed equipment. Dust and thick black smoke rose to the roofs. The elite tank vanguard of the Iron Division was completely destroyed by gravity. A ringing silence hung over the district. Only cooling metal cracked. The captain's surviving soldiers slowly rose from the mud. With empty eyes, they looked at the scale of destruction. The captain crawled from a crater. His beautiful uniform was torn, his face black with soot. With shaking hands, he drew a revolver and aimed it straight at my chest. He shrieked that he would shoot me for sabotage. He screamed that I had deliberately sacrificed his men. Bruno stepped forward, covering me with his body. The huge sergeant silently shifted his grip on the sledgehammer, ready to crush the officer's skull. But I did not even need to give an order. The captain's own surviving soldiers raised their rifles. A dozen barrels pressed toward their former commander's chest. They looked at him with pure hatred. "With all respect, sir," one of the wounded infantrymen said quietly, "this man just pulled us out of the meat grinder you threw us into. Lower the weapon, or we pull our triggers ourselves." The captain's hand trembled. He understood that he had lost control over his men. Slowly, he returned the revolver to its holster, muttering curses. Power in the anchor district finally returned to me. Erica stepped from the shadows. She looked at the twisted tanks, then shifted her gaze to me. There was no more contempt in her eyes. She saw in me a calculating architect of death, equal to their generals. We immediately began restoring defense. I ordered civilians return to the safe lower tiers. Clara sat back at the radio, driving away the useless signalman. The base came back to life. At night, the basements held grim concentration. Marlene operated on the wounded using alcohol lamps. Lotta climbed the water tower to monitor movement on distant streets. Clara called me to the radio. Her face was pale. She had intercepted an encrypted highest priority order. General von Steiner had personally arrived in the city. He was taking command of the siege himself. At that moment, a breathless sentry burst into headquarters. He reported that the western ventilation lock had been broken from the inside. Someone had left the base under cover of darkness, cutting the barbed wire. We rushed to the temporary guardroom where the removed captain had been held. The grate was torn out. From the table, the detailed diagrams of underground district communications that Erica had finished drawing yesterday were missing. The captain had fled to the enemy. His pride proved stronger than loyalty. Now General Steiner knew our every move, every blind corner, and every weak point in the defense of the anchor district. The ring was closing. The enemy stopped attacking head-on. General von Steiner proved too smart for simple infantry waves. He began a methodical surgical siege of our district. The captain who had escaped at night carried not only the resentment of a wounded aristocrat. In his cowardly head, he carried the exact layout of all our hidden communications. Steiner did not shell wide areas. His heavy howitzers methodically opened the earth exactly where we had routed ventilation pipes. In the basements, there was suddenly nothing to breathe. Thick, acrid smoke from the ruins burning above crawled through the telephone tunnels. Madame Lucy's civilians began to suffocate. Children cried in the darkness of the wine cellars. I watched Marlene tear the last clean sheets into masks. She soaked them with the remnants of drinking water and handed them to the wounded so they could breathe. The base we had built so stubbornly was turning into a gas chamber. The system was failing because the enemy now knew every blind corner and every exit. Sergeant Bruno stood by the barricaded door with a crowbar in his hands. His face was black with soot. He waited for an order to break out, understanding that it would be a one-way ticket. If we went above, machine guns would cut us down. If we stayed here, we would suffocate in a couple of hours. Steiner was driving us into a perfect tactical corner. I ordered Lucy to lead people into the deepest drainage collectors. There was dirty water to the knees, but smoke could not reach there. The woman nodded silently and left. There was only one hope left. I spread a crumpled, encrypted map on a wooden crate. Erica bent over it beside me, lighting the paper with a flashlight. The general was preparing the final strike. Clara's radio intercept confirmed the transfer of an armored fist. The enemy was gathering steel for a march along Central Boulevard. The boulevard divided the anchor district exactly in half. If Steiner's heavy machines passed through it, our defense would be cut. We would be killed in pieces before nightfall. I studied the contour lines. Erica moved a thin finger over the markings of old communications. Our intellectual tandem worked at the edge of nervous exhaustion. My finger stopped on Central Boulevard. I remembered our run under artillery fire 2 days before. The pavement there had sagged. The asphalt was covered with a deep web of cracks. Erica looked at me and understood everything without words. She quickly flipped through old port diagrams. The main city drainage aqueduct passed under the boulevard. Madame Lucy had warned of monstrous water pressure during tides. The pipes were old. They held only because of thick red brick support walls. My plan was insane in its simplicity. We would not pierce armor. We would make the street stop being a road at the exact moment when Steiner trusted all his weight to it. If we overloaded the old water line and opened pressure where the soil had already cracked from shelling, the boulevard would become not pavement, but a viscous trap for heavy equipment. Erica gave a crooked smirk, assessing the calculations. She dryly noted that for success, the tanks had to stand exactly in the center of the street, otherwise the collapse would catch only a couple of machines. Steiner was too cautious. He would not send the whole column onto cracked asphalt for no reason. He needed a guarantee. He needed a perfect living bait. That bait had to be me and my radio operator. Clara had to broadcast openly from the old city administration building on that very boulevard. Bruno began cursing, calling it suicide, but there was no time for argument. His group had to move into the lower shafts with Lucy's people and open the old system exactly when the tank stood on the weak spot. No one understood the ancient collectors better than the port workers. No one knew the pressure rhythm better than Lucy. This time, our weapon was not explosives, but water, weight, and a city tired of holding foreign armor. Clara silently assembled the portable radio. There was fear in her eyes, but she did not flinch. The captive radio operator was now risking her life to save our district. We climbed from the basements into gray dust-filled light. The old administration building stood in the middle of Central Boulevard. Its facade had already partially collapsed from earlier fighting. Clara and I took position on the second floor, under the massive oak desk in the mayor's office. The girl unfolded the antenna and clicked the frequency tuning switch. I signaled Bruno through the field telephone. He answered with a short knock in the receiver. My suicide group was deep underground, waist-deep in icy seawater. Clara began transmitting. She used no cipher. The girl tapped in plain language a panicked message requesting emergency evacuation personally for Lieutenant Grant. She played her role perfectly. Her fingers trembled on the key. The rhythm slipped. Steiner's enemy radio operators listened to the performance and believed every desperate dot. The ground began to tremble. The sound of powerful diesel engines rolled onto the street like a heavy wave. Through a gap between boards, I saw gray monsters crawl onto the boulevard.
This is the main weakness of every flawless army. They believe in the thickness of their armor more than in the laws of physics, and physics takes no prisoners.
The first tank stopped at the edge of the sagging asphalt. Steiner was smart. He waited. The machine moved its long gun barrel, aiming directly at our facade. Another heavy shell struck the roof of the neighboring wing. The floor beneath us dropped sharply. Clara lost balance and fell beside me, hitting her shoulder against the thick leg of the desk. The cover was too tight for two. We were squeezed between oak, dust, and the crack of collapsing plaster. She gritted her teeth but did not release the radio key. Dust poured over our heads. Clara breathed fast and unevenly, but continued listening to the air. I reached for the signal flare pistol and brushed her elbow. She hissed sharply for me not to interfere with her work. Even under shelling, angry professional pride remained in her voice. This short, almost ordinary argument unexpectedly relieved paralyzing fear. The radio operator of the enemy empire no longer waited for rescue from her own. She held the communications of Anchor District. A new volley blew out the windows on the first floor. Steiner's tanks believed the bait. Hearing the intercept, the general threw the whole column forward to seize the headquarters. 10 heavy steel vehicles entered Central Boulevard. Their tracks broke the cracked asphalt. The earth groaned and bent under their enormous weight. I looked through the gap. The column reached the central mark. The trader captain rode on the armor of the second vehicle, pointing directly at our collapsing shelter. Now, I grabbed the receiver of the field telephone and shouted a short command to Bruno. In the same second, I pulled Clara by the sleeve, forcing her out from under the desk and into the corridor. A dull, gut-deep jolt came from somewhere in the earth itself. It did not resemble artillery. It was the sound of the city's geological platform breaking. Bruno had blown the supporting brick walls. In the next second, he and Lucy tore the rusty valves open with crowbars. Millions of tons of seawater under pressure struck the soil. The asphalt on Central Boulevard simply stopped existing. It did not explode. It dissolved. A huge strip of land 200 meters long turned into swamp. The first heavy tank dipped its nose and fell into the newly formed crater. Water roared from underground, mixing with mud and pieces of old concrete. Steiner's column was paralyzed. Tracks helplessly churned liquid mud. Machines slid downward, crushing one another under their own monstrous weight. The trader captain tried to jump from the armor, but slipped on wet metal. His scream drowned in the roar of the raging waterfall as the tank rolled onto its side. Our building shook. The undermined foundation began to give way. Support beams cracked like dry matches. I shoved Clara toward the rear window that led onto the roof of an annex. We jumped onto the sloping tiles 1 second before the mayor's office folded inward. Bricks and wooden floors collapsed into the raging muddy lake. I struck my shoulder painfully against a gutter but held the girl from falling. Clara breathed hard, clutching my jacket with fingers white from strain. We looked down. Central Boulevard had become a mass grave for the enemy's elite armor. Gun barrels sticking from the mud looked like tombstones for an old era. The armored strike group of the Iron Division ceased to exist in 3 minutes. Steiner was defeated. Water and gravity had done what hundreds of rifles could not. The general had lost his armored fist. His logistics were destroyed. The urban environment swallowed his ambition, leaving only a muddy pool in the middle of ruins. From below, in the ventilation shaft of the neighboring building, Bruno's soot-smeared face appeared. The sergeant grinned wildly and gave me a thumbs up. They had made it out. I sank onto the cold tiles. My lungs burned from dust. Clara sat beside me, laughing nervously and wiping dirty cheeks with her sleeve. We had survived. Anchor node had held. A heavy stone slab pressed on my chest so hard that every breath burned my lungs. My ears rang thickly from the recent collapse of Central Boulevard. I tried to move my hand, but my fingers were trapped tight by broken brick and wet rebar. Somewhere above, metal scraped dully against stone. "Pull left, damn you," came the familiar roar of Sergeant Bruno. Through a crack in the rubble, dull gray light of the cold morning sky broke through. A piece of wall above me shifted, acrid dust and grit flew into my face. Strong hands grabbed me by the collar of my torn officer uniform. Bruno yanked me to the surface. I fell onto my back, greedily swallowing damp air that smelled of ozone, seaweed, and burned diesel. The sergeant breathed heavily, leaning on a bent crowbar. His face was crusted with mud and soot, but his eyes shone with wild, almost animal triumph. I sat up with difficulty and looked around. Central Boulevard no longer existed. In its place gaped a colossal crater filled with churning seawater. Water continued roaring into the enormous abyss. Shreds of old asphalt and pieces of torn pipes floated on the surface, crashing into steel. In this mud pit protruded the gun turrets of the Iron Division's heavy tanks. General Steiner's pride had become an underwater cemetery of metal. I saw an enemy rifleman trying to climb from the flooded hatch of a command vehicle. His gray uniform was soaked through with heavy black silt. Our soldiers did not even raise rifles. It was meaningless to shoot at those who had already lost a war against gravity and the pressure of old hydraulic systems. Bruno spat thick saliva at his feet. He planted his hands on his hips and laughed loudly and rollingly, watching the drowning elite of enemy engineering. The other landing troops picked up that laughter. They climbed out of shelters, leaning on barricade debris, filthy, wounded, but completely alive. Clara coughed beside me. Her face was gray with dust, and her uniform collar was hopelessly torn. She sat on a piece of concrete, rubbing her bruised knee. If you ever suggest that I play bait again, I will personally strangle you with a radio wire, the radio operator rasped, spitting out sand. She tried to fix the shirt torn across her chest, but the fabric finally split apart, exposing the edge of pale lace. Clara clicked her tongue in irritation. You could at least turn away, Commander, though after we spent an hour rubbing against each other under that cramped desk, it is too late to play untouchable. Her bold smirk cut the hanging tension perfectly. I smiled crookedly in answer, but Marlene was already running toward us, pulling out the remnants of medical supplies as she came. The medic dropped to her knees straight into a puddle, ignoring the dirt. Her sharp, cold fingers instantly began feeling my neck and torn right shoulder. Pulse uneven. Breathing with a wheeze, she clipped sternly, tearing open the last pack of bandage. Sit still, or you will die from internal bleeding. I silently endured while she tightly bound my collarbone. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, but her movements remained perfectly precise down to the millimeter. I did not believe we would survive this night, Marlene said quietly, tightening the knot. I had already prepared morphine for the badly wounded so they would not suffer. She raised her head. Tears of relief stood in her eyes. She had not had to kill her patients out of mercy. My plan had preserved the life of the infirmary. Lotta descended from the surviving roof of the port warehouse. Her sniper rifle was covered in deep scratches, and dark shadows lay under her eyes. Horizon clear, the observer reported quietly. Steiner's infantry is retreating beyond the hills. They are abandoning wounded and equipment. It is a full retreat. She took a crumpled pack of cigarettes from her pocket and silently offered it to me. For unsociable Lotta, it was a gesture of highest trust and recognition of leadership. Keep it, I wheezed. Without your eyes on that tower, we would have missed the flank bypass and fed worms 2 days ago. You earned rest. As if confirming her report, a low horn carried over the bay. The sound was so powerful that its vibration echoed directly in my broken ribs. Massive gray silhouettes of warships emerged from morning fog. The Allied fleet had finally broken through the blockade and reached our port. Reinforcements approached in tight formation. On their decks stood hundreds of soldiers in clean uniforms, ready to land. But there was no one left for them to assault. The city had been held. Madame Lucy organized her people. Civilians began pulling stretchers from the basements to hand our fighters to professional naval doctors. The system worked without my participation. A mechanism built from fear, scarcity, and despair had become a living, self-sufficient social organism. I looked at the 4 girls in gray uniforms. They stood apart, understanding that with the arrival of the fleet, their status could again become that of prisoners of war. Erica stepped forward. Her icy gaze was now filled with a strange mixture of deep exhaustion and respect. She handed me her crumpled map. My work here is done, Lieutenant, the cartographer said evenly. Your architecture of defense proved more complex than any military academy. I shook my head and refused to take the drawings. Instead, I looked into each of their eyes, trying to remember those tired but proud faces. You are not prisoners, I said loudly so my soldiers could hear. In the reports for the Admiral, you will be listed as official district consultants. Bruno hummed in agreement and lowered his rifle muzzle down. My men did not argue. After the hell we had passed through together, the color of a uniform had lost meaning. Clara blinked in surprise. Marlene exhaled in relief, hiding her hands in her pockets. Erica smiled barely noticeably and took out her heavy brass compass. Take it. She placed the cold instrument into my palm. So you do not get lost in history again. This is payment for the lives saved beneath the boulevard. I squeezed the cool metal of the compass. Suddenly cold began rapidly spreading through my hand, rising toward my elbow and chest. The horn of the enormous cruiser broke off in mid-note. A seagull flying above our heads froze in the air as if pinned by an invisible needle. I shifted my gaze to Bruno. The sergeant stood motionless, his mouth open for a shout, but there was no sound. Drops of dirty water hung above a puddle. Space lost color. The fire of the dying ruins became gray. The noise of surf faded, giving way to ringing, almost vacuum silence. A calm, dry voice sounded in my head. It was not a soldier's cry and not an officer's order. The voice belonged to the old man behind the worn counter. Now you know what stands between 2 dates in a history textbook, Victor, the mysterious librarian said directly inside my mind. I had no time to be frightened. The world around me began crumbling into fine sand. The silhouettes of Erica, Clara, Marlene, and Lotta dissolved in blinding light. Consciousness dimmed. The last thing I felt was the unbearable weight of fulfilled duty and the deep, icy emptiness of another time stream. I sharply drew in air and opened my eyes. My lungs burned as if I had surfaced from an immense depth. I convulsively gripped a wooden backrest with my fingers. Under me was an ordinary park bench. Above me, green leaves of tall maples rustled. Warm rays of modern sun broke through the branches. No shooting, no smell of cordite and rotting flesh. Somewhere in the distance, cars hummed, and a cyclist rode along a neat asphalt path. I breathed heavily, clinging to the boards. On my knees lay the same thick book about war that I had asked for in the strange library reading room. The first rational thought struck my temples. It had been only a realistic dream. My brain was exhausted from long reading of archives and had produced a hallucination. I nervously rubbed my face with my hands, trying to chase away the remnants of the nightmare. But then my gaze fell to my palms, and my heart missed one painful beat. Black, oily soot was packed tightly under my fingernails. It was not street dirt. It was a mixture of gun grease, cheap coal, and brick dust. I convulsively rolled up the sleeve of my ordinary civilian jacket. On my forearm was a clear dark red scar and the deep mark of a tightly tied bandage. It was Marlene's signature medical knot. No one else knew how to fix tissue that tightly. The skin around it still held a faint smell of old iodine. With trembling fingers, I reached into my pocket. The fabric felt foreign and unusually thin. At the bottom of the pocket, my fingers found a piece of dense, coarse paper. I brought it into the light. It was a fragment of an old military map. On thick parchment, fading ink showed the collector diagram beneath the boulevard. In the corner of the fragment was a neat signature with even curls. Erica's signature. My hands began to shake. Hallucinations do not leave evidence behind. I jumped from the bench. The book fell to the ground, but I did not look at it. My gaze was fixed on the center of the small square before me. There, among neatly trimmed bushes, stood an old monument of dark bronze. I had never paid attention to this statue before. I approached slowly. It was not the figure of a general on horseback. It was a rough piece of red brick intertwined with thick steel rebar. A heavy memorial plaque was fixed to the granite pedestal. The metal had turned green with time, but the letters were cut deep and perfectly readable. The text read, "In memory of the unknown Lieutenant Grant, the brilliant architect of defense who created Anchor Node and saved thousands of civilians. My surname, my district." I swallowed the lump in my throat and read further. Under the main text was a long list of those who survived that siege. The first name made me hold my breath. Sergeant Bruno. In brackets, it said he rose to major and became the chief engineer of the rebuilt port. My stubborn butcher survived. He stopped being a destroyer and became a builder. I smiled, feeling a hot, salty drop roll down my cheek. But the most important part was written below. 4 women's names were marked in a separate line as honorary citizens who had made an invaluable contribution to saving the city. Erica von Schwartz, Clara, Lotta, Marlene. Beside each name were dates of life. I counted quickly in my head. Each of them had lived a long, peaceful life. They had not rotted in prisoner camps. They had not been shot by Steiner's tribunal. They had become part of a new world that we had torn from death together. Marlene founded the best hospital. Erica became the region's chief cartographer. Clara created a broadcasting network. They built their fates on our ruins. On the back of the monument was a relief scene. Defenders stood against the backdrop of port warehouses. The girls held bandages, binoculars, and a radio in their hands. They did not hide behind men. They stood as equals, former prisoners who became the doctor, signal operator, observer, and cartographer of a saved city. All these fates existed right now only because on a bloody beach, one frightened student had not given a beautiful order for senseless death. I stepped back from the monument. Sunlight slid over bronze letters, and my old textbooks no longer seemed like dead text. I used to think history consisted of arrows on maps, dates, operations, and command mistakes. From far away, it looked almost like a game. Now I knew that between 2 dates fit wet boots, cold basements, bandages, hunger, fear, and people who cannot be abandoned. I clenched the map fragment in my fist. This rough paper was worth more than any diploma because it held not theory, but the price of living decisions. A group of noisy teenagers passed by. They laughed, argued about something small, and did not even look at the monument, and that was exactly why it all mattered. The world must remain quiet enough for people not to know the names of those who held the walls, water, communication, and the last line of defense for them. Wind rustled in maple branches, tearing down a couple of yellow leaves. One fell onto Bruno's bronze shoulder. I carefully brushed it to the ground. Until we meet again, Sergeant, I said quietly. Keep order there, and do not let staff rats dismantle our old barricades again. I picked the book up from the path and slowly walked onto the main avenue of the park. The sun warmed my face, cars hummed behind the trees, the city lived its ordinary life. But now, when I saw the calm street, I heard another layer beneath it. Steps in basements, the knock of a field telephone, the short breaths of people before an order. I had come for a book about war because I wanted to understand history. The librarian gave me not pages, but people I had to keep alive. I fastened my jacket and dissolved into the crowd of the modern metropolis, holding the fragment of the Anchor District map tightly in my pocket.
Victor went into that library thinking history was something you could understand from a safe chair, a map, a date, a battle name, a few smart decisions written after the blood had already dried. But Port Verona taught him the part books always leave quiet. War is not won only by courage. It is won by cold feet that still keep moving, by empty stomachs that still carry ammunition, by prisoners who become useful, by civilians who refuse to disappear, and by one man choosing to build a system when everyone else is ready to break. He did not save the city because he was fearless. He saved it because he finally understood that every life around him was connected. One wire, one corridor, one can of food, one wrong order, 1 second too late. And when he woke up back on that bench, the world looked normal again. But he was not the same person who had entered that library. So the next time you see a single date in a history book, remember this. Behind that date, there were people fighting, freezing, starving, and waiting for someone to make the right choice before it was too late. Thank you for watching. If this story pulled you in, subscribe, because the next one will open another door history tried to keep closed.